thank you, Ramesh, for being here today. Really excited about you joining us and talking about Tantra and yoga from the perspective of science, philosophy, and consciousness. And before we get started, I was hoping that maybe you'd give us a brief introduction about yourself.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. It's very nice to be here. So I've been practicing meditation for a little over 40 years. Started in the mid 70s, and so I have several decades of practice. And as we say in Tantra, it is more practice than theory. And in that sense, we often call Tantra an intuitional science rather than a religion. But that's a point we can get back to. I have also been a writer on yoga and Tantra, especially the last 20 years. And in the last 10 years or so, I've written 5 books, 3 of them on yoga and Tantra. And during that process, I have been able to study and to do a lot of research, and especially into the history of yoga and the philosophy of yoga, using Sri Anandamurti's ideas, my guru. And that has been very, very interesting. And in the last few years, I've been teaching at something called Embodied Philosophy. It's an outfit from New York, where different scholars in yoga and Tantra have come together to teach the philosophy and the practice of yoga and Tantra. And I've been teaching a course on the history, which has been very interesting. And so that's a little bit about my background. And finally, the last 15 years, I've been living in Asheville, North Carolina, on a retreat center that we started. And so my work is directly involved in teaching about yoga and meditation, and also about naturopathy and Ayurveda. So that's a little bit about my background.
Thank you. What a wealth of knowledge and experience you're bringing. That's wonderful. So we're going to start. The first question is, what is Tantra as a religion, a philosophy, or is it a science?
Yeah, that's a good question. So personally, I like to think of it as a little bit of everything. It depends on how we use terminology. If we think of Tantra as a religion, I would say that Tantra is religious, yes, in a very universal sense. It believes in it's theistic in the sense that it believes in the concept of God or some divine intelligence, or however you may like to say it. And when you say that, materialist scientists will not like you. They will think that you're a dogmatist and you're beyond science and so on. And then on top of that, if you say, oh, well, Tantra is also scientific, then you have lost them. Then they will not. So these are very touchy subjects. And so we have to be careful about how we define these terms. But in its essence, religion means, religare means to come to the understanding of some kind of oneness. And that is really what yoga means. Yoga means union in one explanation of yoga. And that is, especially in a tantric sense, what yoga means in Tantra. Tantra means the union between the unit mind and the cosmic mind. So in deep meditation, when we use our consciousness to unify that consciousness with cosmic consciousness, which Tantra says is everywhere, that is what Tantra means in terms of unification and in terms of the definition of yoga. Tantra also is a path of transformation. So ta in the word Tantra means something static, and tra means to liberate. And so Tantra is the path of liberation from confinement, from staticity, from being stuck to feeling liberated and free. So that's the, you could say, the literal translation of what Tantra is. And then finally, as far as practice is concerned, Tantra is not a belief system, it is a practice, because it is the practice of meditation, the practice of asanas to refine the body, to make the body more subtle. And, it's very interesting because a few years ago, a PhD student from the University of SOAS, University in London, went to India with one question in mind, and she asked about 80 different sadhus, yogis, that we could say loosely said are tantric practitioners. She asked them, why do you practice asana? And invariably their answer was to prepare the body for meditation. So this is a different understanding than most Westerners have about asanas, because asanas today is mainly for physical balance and health, and then secondarily for some kind of mental health, stress relief, and so on, and less about spirituality. Although that we could say is changing a little bit. But so anyway, that gives a little bit of an understanding of what Tantra is. So I would say it's a religion in the sense of, yes, it believes in a divine entity, and Tantra claims that can be proven by the experience of it. So and that's the claim that Tantra makes to it being a science. And so Anandamurti will say, the proof is in the pudding, and that's why I'm calling it an intuitional science. You practice this, you will experience that this phenomenon exists. So that's how Tantra uses or explain that it is a science. So, and philosophically, Tantra is sublimely logical and rational. It's not, a belief in ghosts or strange phenomena that is very hard to verify, that seems illogical. The whole philosophy is very practical and very logical and rational. So in that sense, it's purely philosophical. And in the broadest sense, that is also science.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think the idea of that practice, I thought that you brought up was so important. And so you brought up religion, we talked about religion, and then, so what is the main difference between religion and spirituality from a Tantra perspective?
Yeah, that's another good question. So religion is, from a Tantra perspective, a belief system. You are believing, for example, if we take it in the dogmatic sense, you believe in the Bible, and in the Bible it says that the world was created in 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. So if you believe in that, that's religion, and that's a belief system. And then you will learn that science has found that's not exactly right. It took a little more than 6 days, through evolution and so on. So religion is a belief system, and often is dogmatic, and it has dogmatic concepts that you have to follow in order to be part of the religion. And so in Tantra, we are careful about stating that it's based on practice, as I said before, and we call that an intuitional science. This is the term that Anandamurti is using, and I think it's an important term and an important distinction between the religious belief system. Yes, maybe you have to believe that the teacher says samadhi is possible. The union between your consciousness and cosmic consciousness is possible. Yes, maybe you believe in that and you haven't experienced it, but that statement is based on the experience of other people who have experienced it. So that I would say the difference between religion and Tantra then is that religion is based on a belief system that cannot be verified scientifically or logically, whereas Tantra is based on practice and a verified system through the authorities of the teachers or through your own practice. So in other words, you practice long enough, yes, you will experience what your teacher told you will experience. But if you believe that the world was created in 6 days, no matter how long you believe in it, it will not become true.
So one thing I keyword was the intuitional science that you were talking
Intuitional science, yeah. So it's different. So material science is empirical in the sense that it depends on our senses. Intuitional science is extrasensory. It is beyond the sensual experience. So you have an experience of love that does not depend on any external input, because it purely comes from within. So but you cannot say that because it purely comes from within, it's not there, it's not real. You know it's real because you've experienced it. So spiritual states depends on the revelation of the practitioner, and then telling it to somebody else, and then it's being verified by the rest of the tantric club, so to speak, or the tantric peers. And that's how Tantra has developed a very systematic system of philosophy throughout, the several thousand years. And Anandamurti's philosophy is an extension of those older philosophies, like the Sankhya philosophy or the Yoga Sutras, which Anandamurti would say is also part of Tantra. And then his own philosophy in Ananda Sutram, which is really an extension, an evolution, sort of an add-on to all of these older philosophies, and an improvement in many ways.
So how does Tantra define or explain consciousness?
Again, the example of science. So science and scientists will say the hard question of consciousness, because they cannot get their heads wrapped around it. They cannot understand what it is. And so they call it the hard question. And it's sort of, in a way, it's sort of the last frontier of science. But the reason they cannot understand it is because they're depending on empiricism as related to the sensory world. In other words, science in a material sense is based on sensory input or verification. But when it comes to mathematics, for example, or logic, you cannot hook, an EEG machine up to a mathematical genius, and then all the formulas will just be transferred into that machine. It doesn't happen. So even in terms of consciousness, when it comes to logic and reason, there is already, you have jumped beyond the material. And so we need to think of hard science and soft science. So hard science has to deal with genetics and physical things like in physics and so on. And then the soft science are psychology, mathematics, and then we move into the spiritual realm. And that's why we call that an intuitional science. And so it is important to understand, I guess, science from a broad perspective, because we could say that material science is reductionist. It can understand evolution based on genetic changes that has happened, and that's generally now the latest science. The neo-Darwinist science is understanding evolution based on genetics, like Richard Dawkins. But Richard Dawkins is, again, very much against, anything spiritual, often calls it dogmatic and so on. So we need to really broaden our understanding of what science is in order to understand science. And so intuitional science is not against material science or even reductionist science. It's just that so in other words, spiritual people need to accept physical science. Physical scientists need to accept the intuitional science. Then we can have an intelligent dialogue. Now that dialogue is often, some are way out in New Age land and talk about angels and so on. and then the material sciences are in the material sphere, and there's no real dialogue. But in many ways, like if you take someone like Rupert Sheldrake, who wrote a book called The Science Delusion, he is very much, I feel, in line with what Baba is talking about when it comes to science, and trying to bridge that gap between material science, mysticism, and spirituality, and going at it in a very scientific way.
Brought up materialism. So what is the main difference between the philosophy of materialism and the philosophy of Tantra?
So materialism is the idea that everything can be explained from a material point of view. So, for example, love can be explained by neurons in the brain firing in a certain way, or through chemistry and so on. You can measure, so they can hook you up to a brain scan. And then when you are in the loving state, they can show this is what happens. This part of the brain lights up and so on. That's one way that material science functions. But material science, through that way of explaining what the world is about, cannot understand or explain what that love feels like. It cannot explain, for example, paranormal phenomenon. Like, for example, I spent many times with Anandamurti, and I observed how his mind worked, and saw incredible, what we would call mysterious happenings, or just things that you wouldn't be able to accept through a normal understanding of how the world works. He could read people's minds, like it was a book, and he could talk about objects as if he was, had this cosmic encyclopedia in his mind. It was just unbelievable. You were just stunned, seeing that. These phenomena science cannot explain. Material science cannot. And that's why they're saying it's all a lie. It doesn't exist. You're making it up. And that's why scientists like Rupert Sheldrake, is heavily criticized by material scientists. So that's why material science has a very limited scope. But that is changing through system sciences, which are looking at science in a broader sense through systems, and also through some of the latest neuroscientists, quantum physics. Many of the quantum physicists, they were certainly material scientists, but when they wanted to explain how quantum physics worked, they used examples from Tantra, Shiva, the dance of Shiva. Ilya Prigogine, who was a chemist and developed the second law of thermodynamics, he used Shiva's dance, Tandava, as a symbol to explain how the second law of thermodynamics worked. So here you see these scientists that are deeply involved in empirical science opening their minds into saying, basically, there is something in Eastern philosophy and practice and yoga and Tantra that we haven't ventured into yet. And that's why we are borrowing their terms. So put another way, holistic science like Ayurveda is very good at healing certain diseases, but is useless when it comes to studying genes or DNA. Yeah. So what I'm basically saying, and which I'm hoping that, it's happening more and more. It is happening more and more. Again, as I said before, there needs to be a dialogue. And then these great scientists, they understand that.
Yeah, exactly. The dialogue, I think, is really important. And hopefully
Yeah, it's very, very important.
In the future. So I want to go a little bit back to consciousness. Are there various levels of consciousness according to Tantra?
Tantra is based on two concepts, Shiva and Shakti. And Anandamurti's first sutra is Shiva, Shakti, Atmakam, Brahma. which means that Shiva and Shakti are composites of Brahma. And then the question is, what is Brahma? Brahma is cosmic consciousness. So in cosmic consciousness, there are two principles: Shiva, which is consciousness, and Shakti, which is energy. And so in very simple terms, Tantra explains evolution or creation as Shakti leaving Shiva and starting creation. And so in Ananda Sutram, for example, which is based on what creation is and how Tantra outlines creation, it is basically the idea that consciousness is the beginning of everything. So consciousness as Brahma is a witnessing entity that is within anything. Here I have some shoe polish here. And so Tantra will say, this is also consciousness. Material things are consciousness. And the interesting thing is that many scientists, mathematicians, the panpsychism is something that the listener should look up. Alfred North Whitehead was a panpsychist, and he basically said, in everything there is consciousness. So this is purely Tantra, and this was a brilliant scientist. Bertrand Russell was also a panpsychist, and panpsychism is now coming back into science. So that's on a very sort of cosmic scale. And then Tantra, from a microcosmic scale, says that the body is part of consciousness. And that's when we talk about different koshas. So the body is Annamaya kosha, which is the food kosha. It's made up of the food that we eat. It's purely physical. Then we have the Kamamaya kosha, which is consciousness in a more subtle way, which is our senses. How do I perceive the world through my eyes, through my feelings, my hands, through the food, and so on. This is Kamamaya kosha. Then we have Manomaya kosha, which is even more subtler. So here you see how subtle, logical, and rational Tantra is in explaining consciousness. So consciousness comes from the small subtle to the crude through evolution, and then again it evolves back into the more subtle through becoming more and more subtle from the material realm, which is our body, into the conscious sensory realm, which is our Kamamaya kosha. Then the Manomaya kosha, which is our contemplative mind, memory, feeling of pleasure and pain. And then even more subtle, the Atismana kosha, which is the intuitional realm, and which psychologists like Carl Jung called us the collective unconscious. So he had this term, the conscious mind, which would be Kamamaya kosha, the unconscious, which would be Manomaya kosha, and then the Atimanas kosha, which is his collective unconscious. And this is where people start to feel the beginning of the spiritual realm through experiences of synchronicity, experiences of feeling like somebody is looking at you, and then you turn, yes, there is someone looking at me. Feelings of a premonition that such and such person is coming to see me. These are all experiences in the Atimanas kosha, and many of the scientific formulas and artistic endeavors, poems, and so on, come to us through this subtle Atimanas kosha or Atimanas consciousness. And then the fourth kosha is the Vijnanamaya kosha, which is about discrimination and detachment. Knowing, not on a sort of simple term what is good and what is bad, but deeply spiritually knowing and then acting upon what is right for my spiritual path and so on, and to truly understand what is right and wrong. And then detachment, that if I'm too attached to this, then I'm not going to, progress on my spiritual path. If I'm too detached to money, to food, fame, whatever it is, that is going to hinder me on my spiritual path. And so I need to balance my life. So that kind of understanding comes from the Vijnanamaya kosha. And then finally, Hiranamaya kosha, which is the causal mind. Hiranama means the golden mind. This is when the yogi starts experiencing bliss, deep bliss, and that's why it's called the golden kosha. And then, so that's within the mind, chitta, in the Yoga Sutra terms. And then beyond chitta is Atman, the soul. So you see how beautiful yoga or Tantra has developed an understanding of the mind and consciousness. And then as sort of going back to where we started, then Tantra says when there is unification between Jivatman, your Atman, which would include all the koshas and so on, and the cosmic Paramatman, that's what yoga is all about. So Tantra is a very sophisticated way of understanding the koshas. Now, I should also say, for those people who are interested in sort of comparative study, the kosha model that Anandamurti presents is a little different than the Vedantic kosha model, and sometimes that is confusing to people. But I think that this model is very, very practical and wonderful. And Anandamurti used to say that it is important for the evolution of meditation to have some understanding of the koshas. This is very helpful.
It'd be wonderful one day if we were actually able to have this in school,
Yeah,
instead of as part of a science class or something like that. It'd be amazing.
Yeah, definitely. If children can, learn these concepts
yes,
early on,
yes,
it will have a tremendous impact. Yeah,
exactly, tremendous. So, what is the view of Tantra on race and social equality, and is that different than Hinduism?
I've been teaching in the history class about yoga and appropriation. And appropriation, is about us in the West, in the privileged West, taking ideas from other cultures and making them our own, or not acknowledge them as coming from somewhere else, or disrespectfully turning them around. Like somebody, in my class, somebody pointed out they had seen Shiva on a toilet, seat, things like that. Just simple things like that. This is a sensitive topic in a way, but at the same time, it is also a very dark subject, and it needs to be highlighted. It needs to be brought into the light. But I'm mentioning it because of the complexities of it historically, and this is not well understood by scholars in the West, but it is something that Anandamurti mentions again and again, and that is that he highlights the fact that Tantra never accepted the caste system. So where did the caste system come from? Most likely it came from the Vedic people who, according to Anandamurti, and now supported by genetic scientists, from the Vedic Aryan people moving into India 4,000 or 5,000 before Christ, they brought with them a system of 4 classes: the workers, the Shudras, the warriors, the Kshatriyans, the Viprans, the intellectuals, and the Vaishya, the sort of the merchants, or at least that kind of a system emerged over time. They divided the people. And Anandamurti also mentions that when they came into India, the people living in India were dark-skinned, and perhaps this is the origin of racism. Who knows? And I'm not blaming this on Hindus by any means, because Hinduism didn't even exist at that time. That's another hot topic, because Hinduism is hardly more than 1,000 years old as a concept. Shiva was not Hindu. Krishna was not Hindu. Patanjali, who lived 2,000 years ago, was not the Hindu. Hinduism is 1,000 years old at the most. And the British really cemented this idea of Hinduism to their advantage. And so in that sense, what we have as Hinduism today is maybe, just a few hundred years old, and the British took advantage of that, the fact that there were different castes, and in many ways emphasized it, because then it was easier to control people. So let's say that the caste system had an origin that was based in something based on psychological qualities of people. Because yes, some people are more inclined to do hard work, to build, than to sell, and so on, and others are more intellectual, others are more warrior-like. These are psychological archetypes that I think make sense. But over time, and around a few hundred years before Christ, there came a book called the Book of Manu, Manu, that solidified hundreds of castes, sort of made it into a system. And also in the tenets of Manu, there are many very negative statements about women, that the women should not study the Vedas. If a woman listened to the Vedas, then you should pour molten lead into their ear, and so on. I mean, horrible things. So it has the origin of the caste system has a very dark history, which is part of the rest until today. As I said in the beginning, Tantra never accepted the caste system. And so Tantra was anti-Veda. So it was outside of the Vedic system, and it is very likely, not very likely, it is likely that yoga itself developed mostly outside of the Vedic society at a very early. So in other words, Indian society is sort of a blend of the Vedic and the Tantric or the yogic paths. Scholars think that the yoga is about 2,500 years. Baba said it's about 7,000 years, much, much older. But the current academics agree with Baba, saying that it developed outside of the Vedas. And especially they also know and emphasize that Tantra never accepted the class system or the caste system, and that women could be gurus in the Tantric system, women could be teachers. There was no separation in that sense. So that, I would say, is the main difference between Tantra and Hinduism. Hinduism today is based on many of these superstitions around caste and so on. Constitutionally, India does not accept the caste system, but it is like racism here in the US and other places. It is very, very much a real thing. There are 150 million Dalits, people without caste. So you can imagine people who are not even part of the caste system, not even part of the hierarchy. They have no caste at all. So it's a very dark aspect. And so I guess the main difference then is Tantra never accepted caste, whereas in Hindu society, it was very much part of it, and it still is.
Thank you. I think it's so important, especially as we're here trying to develop as planetary leaders, that we have a better understanding of what's going on worldwide and what history tells us. So again,
Right,
thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.